From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome. I am Francisco Macias from the Law Library of Congress. We have had a wonderful series of events in observance of Hispanic Heritage Month, and I want to thank all my colleagues for all the work they have done to make 2016 another successful celebration of our heritage. Today, I believe we are in for a special treat. In observance of Hispanic Heritage Month, our special guest is the award-winning Filipino American writer Jon Pineda, because no Hispanic Heritage Month could ever be complete without talking a little bit about the Philippines. He is the author of 5 books. His novel, Apology, won the Milkweed National Fiction Prize, and his memoir, Sleep in Me, made the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers selection. His poetic voice is captured in the following collections: Birthmark, winner of the Crab Orchard Award Series Open Competition; The Translator's Diary, winner of the Green Rose Prize in Poetry; and Little Andigines, recently named a finalist for the 2016 Library of Virginia Literary Award in Poetry. A core faculty member in the Low Residency Master of Fine Arts program at Queen's University of Charlotte, Jon is assistant professor of English at the University of Mary Washington and has twice served on the teaching faculty for the Kundiman Asian American Poets Retreat held at Fordham University. Of his work, Oliver de la Paz stated, "Regardless of the distance, Jon Pineda's resolute and lyrical language traverses the spectrum of human conditions and eases our lonely and troubled selves into the possibility of joy." A special note of thanks goes to Bailey Slaughter for bringing Jon and his work to our attention. And now we leave Jon in the capable hands of our colleague Roberto Salazar, a senior program specialist from the Office of Equal Employment Opportunity and Diversity Programs. And now please join me in welcoming Jon Pineda.
Thank you, Francisco. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress. Our program's title today, Filipino Americans, the Other Asian Americans. When it comes to labels of identity, we have the tendency to assume things about others, don't we? That being said, what is it that you think other Americans should know about Filipino Americans?
Yeah, well, one of the things, when I think about Filipino Americans, the first thing I think of is the family, the way in which so many Filipino American families are very welcoming and very generous. And you know, this isn't by any means, it doesn't make them an exceptional group. I think there are other cultures that do the same thing, but Filipino American families that I grew up around, you know, lots of big parties, lots of lumpia, lots of pancit, chicken adobo, bibingka, you name it. And extended friends were brought in, treated in some ways as relatives as well. But as far as Filipino Americans in terms of their imprint on American society, I think it's exciting when you think about how early they made their presence known here in the United States. There's the mention, of course, of the 16th century, where the Filipino mariners had come over to California in New Spain. But after that, the first Asian settlement, I believe, was in 1763, and it was the St. Malo fishing village, which is in just south of New Orleans in Louisiana. And it was there for almost a little over, I think, 150 years. It was able to kind of remain intact until it was destroyed by a hurricane in 1915. So the Filipino presence in the United States has been here, and then I should also note that there are different waves of Filipino American or Filipino immigration to the United States. And so if you meet a Filipino, it's the first thing I'll ask is, oh, where are you from, like in the islands? Because the islands, there's 7,000 islands in the archipelago, and there are over 120, I believe, languages spoken in the Philippines. So I've seen this. I've been in situations where a number of Filipinos are getting together, and they're not necessarily fully understanding each other because they speak different dialects or they speak different languages, but yet someone who would kind of see them might visually think that they're somewhat cohesive in the way that they look, but actually they're from different regions in the Philippines. So my father is from the island of Luzon. He's Papangan and grew up kind of north of Manila. There are Filipinos, let's say, from Mindanao, and the dialect they speak my father wouldn't be able to understand. So that would be one of the things that I would offer, is to say that it's a small country, the Philippines, but within that country there's a very large community of diversity that exists because of the archipelago. That translates when you think about the immigration to the United States with let's say the Manong generation in the 1915 or 1920s or so, the laborers that had come to the United States from the Ilocano region, and typically settled in California or Hawaii. This portion of the Philippines has a large connection there. But then on the East Coast, a lot of Filipinos came over after World War II. So with Filipinos and their having fought in World War II, especially because of the Japanese occupation, I have an uncle who died in the Bataan Death March. It's something that, like, when you really are looking at the waves of immigration of the Filipinos here, there you can point to different regions, and then you can also look at kind of a class system as well. The recent wave of immigration from the Philippines being healthcare workers, doctors, and nurses. But prior, when the Filipinos came in, and I want to say maybe the third wave after World War II, they joined the Navy. My father came here because of the Navy. He was allowed to join the Navy when he was still in the islands, and then transfer here, and then went through the rigors in order to become a citizen. So that would probably be the first thing, is just to say that it's very diverse in the scope of the community of Filipino Americans, but at the same time it's also very tight-knit and a welcoming community too.
You touched on this in your comment, and that is the imprint of Filipinos in the United States. Certainly not a new imprint, dating back to the 16th century. In fact, it was 1587, October 18th of 1587, that the first Filipino mariners became the first recorded Asians, if you will, that came to America on board what was then the Spanish galleon named Nuestra Señora de Esperanza, which, as I understand, was under the command of Pedro de Unamuno at Morro Bay, California. This was a time, of course, back then in 1587, when California and in fact the Philippines were part of the Kingdom of New Spain. And so that certainly is a significant historical moment for Filipino Americans. I imagine there are other moments of pride for the Filipino American community. What are some of those moments that come to your mind?
Well, when I was growing up, my dad would talk about Roman Gabriel, and Roman Gabriel was the MVP of the NFL back in the late 60s, and he was mestizo, and so that was the first time that in some ways Filipino Americans, well, at least in the NFL, here was this major accomplishment that came forward. But there are also multiple situations in sports. I think of that. But there are also wonderful political leaders that have. I grew up in the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area, so that was. I always saw Filipinos, and then when I moved away from that area, I didn't see Filipinos. So I come to find out that there were, I think when I was growing up in that area, there were over 30,000 Filipino or Filipino Americans living in that area at the time. I'm sure it's much larger now, but so I was kind of insulated in that way. But since then, there have been city council members, House of Representatives, those the ways in which other cultures have made a positive impact on the American society. Another major thing that's occurred in the last, I guess in the last 15 years, to 12 to 15 years, is that with Kundiman, in the introduction, the gracious introduction, the Kundiman is an Asian American literary organization that was started by two Filipino American writers, Sarah Gambito and Joseph Agaspi, who are now starting to get lots of acclaim. They're in New York. And what they did is they were able to create a community of Filipino American writers who were winning prizes. A number of us were starting to kind of get our work out there, and they brought us together to be mentors for the next generation of writers who were or are coming up and not having to think, am I allowed to write about this? They're just writing about their experiences. When I was first starting and writing about being part Filipino, there was a part of me that felt, as I wondered, could I write about this? And which was just kind of showing just my lack of I would say maybe even courage as a writer. I needed to kind of come to that on my own. But Kundiman has stepped forward, and since then, fellows from that program have won the Walt Whitman Award, which is from the Academy of American Poets. It's the best first book by an American poet. They've won these national prizes, the National Poetry Series. These are the kinds of forays into into kind of the venerated American literature halls, let's say, that the Filipino Americans are making a major impact. And they're becoming professors at other universities, and they're able to kind of spread this knowledge. So that for me has been an unbelievably amazing impact, because these are our novelists and our poets and our fiction writers, our creative nonfiction writers. These are the people that are in language humanizing the culture for a larger majority in a readership, and I find that fascinating and inspiring. And when I mentioned kind of my lack of courage, it wasn't so much that I was fearful of not having any kind of fear of not being able to write about something. I didn't have models for writing about being half. There were no books written by mestizo poets who were directly addressing that, or at least models that I had found. And some of my Filipino American writer friends would just say, well, then you write it. What are you waiting for? You write it. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'll write it. And so now it becomes, we become part of that literature. So I think that has been a huge impact.
Well, and indeed, you've been one of the groundbreakers in that regard. So let's talk about your writing and your creative experience. How has that been reflected, perhaps? How has it been reflected, your experience as a Filipino American, and what influence has that had in your creativity?
It's had a lot. When I would go to these Filipino gatherings when I was very young, we at the time were one of the only families who were mixed, who were mestizo. And I remember just kind of walking around, and I would just hear different languages. Sometimes you would hear Spanish, sometimes you would hear Tagalog, sometimes you would hear, Visayan. I mean, not that I speak these languages with any kind of fluency, but I could recognize certain things. And so this attention to language grafted on me in a very early age. Now mix in that my mom was raised on a farm in North Carolina, and very much from a rural background and a northeastern North Carolina dialect. So there was also a way in which I was understanding that speakers of English, given their regional differences, bring other kinds of focus. They use language differently, and so I've always loved that. I've always been fascinated by the ability to communicate, and then striving to make these connections between perhaps disparate communities. In my situation, and with writing, I've always found that I can have my intention, and that kind of begins how I start writing. But it's actually once I put the language on the page, and once I have the words there, then I need to revise and see if I'm, building the image in a way that feels accessible, that's not over intellectualized, that's not, preening, is not, I want my poems to do certain things, but most importantly, I want my poems to have communion with the reader. So I think my Filipino background with the Catholic Church, we Filipino Americans have a very interesting relationship with Catholicism, not different from other colonized areas that have also had Catholicism kind of placed on them, but a love for saints, a love for these narratives of sacrifice. That was something that growing up I heard a lot of that. My dad would tell me these stories about, and he would smile as he would talk about these elderly women in his village that would crawl to the church on their knees. And he just really thought that was amazing, like in terms of the faith that they had. And so that was something that impressed me. Another thing has been the way in which, by being mestizo, I feel as if I'm one foot in one world and one foot in another world. But I'm never fully in one. So when I'm with my Filipino friends, my writing friends, who perhaps might have parents that are full Filipino, we'll say, air quotes, or this idea, I'm other. I'm part of the group, and I'm not. Same goes for my friends that might not be Filipino. So I think that also informs my creativity, that I understand that that alone I have a different relationship with the temporal and what's transient, what stays, what's permanent. I'm not as interested in dominating the idea of time. I'm much more interested in allowing for the sense of flux. Much more interested in hybridity. I love experimentation in the hybrid forms, and identity is, I'm less interested in trying to harken back to a tradition. I'll acknowledge a tradition, but I'm more interested in moving forward to where I bring everything forward. And that requires, in some ways, a relinquishing of the self. And I think as a writer, that's very important. And so my own mestizo experience, in some ways, has kind of prepared me for that.
Yes, it almost sounds as though you've maintained this outsider-looking-in perspective of sorts,
Yes.
while not losing your identity in the culture. You touched on certainly what I consider to be one of the impacts of Spain on the Philippines, Catholicism. We touched on the fact that the Philippines was part of New Spain in the 16th century. No doubt there were many other impacts that Spain had on the Philippines and Filipinos. What are some of those impacts that carry through today that are evident in Filipino and Filipino American culture that you've observed?
Well, yes, the impact of Spain, I think, is still present in the names, in the language. In Tagalog, you can find words that aren't spelled the same way as perhaps in Spanish, but you can, when you hear the word, it's almost as if an American who doesn't speak Spanish was phonetically writing Spanish, and then you see that word and it's a Tagalog word. That's something that kind of sits there and ghosts its way through the Filipino culture. I find that Spain is very much a ghost in the language. It's also the way in which the islands were colonized and remained colonized for over 300 years, there was this interesting situation, and the Tagalogs that were the native culture that was present in the islands when Spain arrived. The Tagalogs already had a written script. They already had a literature that they had a language, and and I believe the written script, you'll hear it referenced as Alibata, which I think is incorrect. I think that's been somehow the term that's favored is Babain, I think is the pronunciation, and the script it's an ancient script. And so, when I think about the way that Spain, with the colonizing, coming forward and taking the culture that was there and molding it in a way into the framework of Catholicism. For instance, in the Filipino history, there is a term, babaylan, the shaman or priestess. They were very much a part of the Filipino culture at the time before Spain, and so this idea of the matriarch was in effect present. So when you talk to Filipino Americans about their faith, many will talk about Mary, the novena for Mary, the Virgin Mary, very much woven into that portion of the Filipino American experience. My father, when he relocated to Mobile, Alabama, he became friends with the local priest, and the first thing that he asked was, do you have a novena for Mary? And the priest was like, no, we don't. And my dad worked with them to set this up, and suddenly my dad said all these Filipinos came out, from nearby because they heard about the novena and they wanted to be a part of this. So that's how I see Spain still being woven into the cultures, that it's very much the identity of faith. It's for those who practice. It's there. The food, the empanadas, the different. When you even look at, I look at lumpia, I look at the egg roll, and I still think of like a tamale or something. Some kind of way in which there's this mix. It makes sense. The Philippines was colonized not from continental Spain, but from New Spain, from Mexico, and so to have, and because of the Manila Acapulco route with the silver that was being moved back and forth. We're talking hundreds of years, and so that's it would make sense that there would be these intersections of culture, whether it be language or religion or food.
Aside from that colonization, the fact still remains that there's an ancestral Asian culture that prevails and certainly manifests itself in a scene, I suspect. How is that seen and evident in today's Filipino American culture, that ancestral?
It's something that I feel when I talk with my writer friends about this. I think that this generation is looking back and trying to find that. It's not anything I would say that stands kind of at the fore. It's more that a lot of my writer friends are returning. So the script that I had mentioned is something that Sarah Gambito from Kundiman had brought to my attention, and we were sitting around talking about this very thing, and she said, do you know about this script, and was sharing it with other Filipino American writers, and we didn't know. And so this was a way that this was being presented. In those same discussions, we've also talked about the mythology and these creation stories. Maganda, the first woman, beautiful. I guess that is the word for beautiful. and Malakas, I think is the word for strength, I think was the first man, and they emerged from a shoot of bamboo. I could be totally wrong, but this was like, yeah, so we've been, our writers have really embraced the idea of these creation myths as it relates to the Philippines, as it relates to trying to bring a voice to something that perhaps has been tamped down. I mean, that's an identity that I could understand the colonizer not wanting to, have these stories be so pervasive, because that allows for, unity. It allows for these ways in which people can look back and say, oh, we all believe this one thing, or we all agree that this one thing exists. Kundiman, just even the word itself, the Kundiman is a love song that was, that one would write for a beloved, but it was also veiled in a way that it was kind of the love for the country. So when you had the Kundiman being, one would sing this, the colonizer didn't know it was really kind of hearkening back for the love of the country. It's kind of a coded way to speak about these things in the face of oppression. And that's how I think the writers now from this generation are using the Kundiman, say the full umbrella of the Kundiman as this opportunity to say, of course we're Americans, so we get, we have these freedoms, but we're talking about our identities now. We're also wanting to kind of go back and try to understand, to contextualize some of the things that perhaps we should have known, but that we don't know.
You've been immersed in this for some time, obviously. How has all of this manifested itself in your personal experience, your personal American experience?
Yes, it has been. It's been exciting because I feel like I was part of this club that no one told me the rules and no one told me the password to get into, but yet they said, why haven't you been here this whole time? This way in which I'm looking inward and trying to understand my place, like what authority can I express myself and still be part of the Filipino American experience. I'm fascinated by the islands, and as well as the diversity of the islands. I sense, being an outsider looking in at times, that there are regional differences. There are ways in which there's contention based on whether you're from the north or the south. There are economic disparities. There are all these things that kind of, as for any country, it's out there. And so that, I think, carries over for those who've immigrated to the States, and then they set up communities here and there. And so depending on where you're from, you have some of this bias. As an outsider looking in, I feel like I'm able to, study it in a way that isn't, it's not with contempt. I mean, I'm studying it with open eyes, and I'm very much interested in it. And I feel like the more I learn about the Filipino experience, the more I answer my own questions of my Filipino American experience. And I've sensed that as we continue on as a country, and as we assimilate, even more, and these constructs of hybridity come forward, that we'll have, another generation, like for instance my children, that are a quarter Filipino, what does that mean for them in their experience? Doesn't make them any less, in claiming that heritage, in the same way that I have other parts of my heritage that I'm still learning about. Like on my grandmother's side in the Philippines, her family can trace lineage back to Spain, and the name Nunez is one that's part of our family. But I've yet to fully discover what that means. And so I think this idea that that the culture has to remain static is one that I personally I've never felt the strength of that. I've always derived strength from the fact that it's shifting and moving and exposes itself in different forms. And so I'm very much interested in that, in my poetics as well as just in my life.
And of course, we recognize that Filipino Americans are not part of the dominant culture in America. And when I say dominant culture, I'm talking about the predominant culture, which in America is typically white, heterosexual, male, Christian, right? That being said, then what do you perceive as some of the greatest challenges that Filipino Americans face culturally, if you will, and in terms of identity within that broader American mosaic?
Well, I will say that the communities that I've encountered in Pensacola, Florida, in the Virginia Beach area, in out west in Oakland, in California, others in Seattle and in Washington, they're divided regionally, and perhaps those particular immigrant communities can kind of point to those regional differences in the islands, but as a whole, my feeling is that there's so much pride, and the younger generations that are creating these cultural clubs at the university level, at the high school level, the community level, they're there. They're out there, and it doesn't take much to find a dance competition somewhere where Filipinos are setting up something, or a hip hop, venue, something where that. So I think the younger generation is not moving away from the traditions. I think they're keeping them close, but at the same time they're forging ahead in this idea of what does it mean to be a Filipino American right now? Very different than what it meant in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. Now there's clearly more education in the Manong generation of the difficulties that the prior generations endured. Much more education and much more attention, and that's exciting. I think that embracing the history, and at the same time expressing individuality, which might potentially mean a Filipino American that doesn't necessarily look like a typical Filipino American. I mean, being open to this is how the culture will survive. It's having that vision in some ways of the mestizo, one foot in one world, one foot in the other world. But the difference in some ways that the new generation will have that I didn't is that they'll never ask the question, can I do this? Like, it will be, this is what I do. And I'm excited by that. That to me, I find extremely inspiring, and it's an empowering thing. And I think about my own children. We have a son and a daughter, and I love the idea that they'll be able to embrace their Filipino heritage and at the same time not question whether they're allowed to or not.
Excellent perspective. Those are the softball questions. Let's get to the tough questions.
All right, let's do it.
Let's reach out to our audience and invite you to ask any questions you may have.
I have one here. I had a Filipino friend. She used to live in Cavite City, and she said that the main place of Manila, there's like a hero called Enrico Jose. Can you explain about that country's holiday?
Enrico Jose, I'm not familiar. Yeah, I know Jose Rizal.
Yeah, Jose Rizal.
Oh, okay, so Jose Rizal was part of the Ilustrado generation in the Philippines, which were the middle to upper middle class Filipinos that would send their children to Europe for education. So Rizal went to Spain, as a matter of fact, and studied to become an ophthalmologist. He was executed before the start of the Filipino American War. He was executed, I believe, in 1896. He had written a piece, or he'd written a number of works. One in particular, No Limitang Here, is a novel that in some ways was an indictment on the friars, on the Spanish friars. He was seen as someone that would disrupt the population and give a voice to the Filipinos in a way that Spain didn't want. So what they did is they made Filipinos execute Rizal. But I think the way it's explained is that if the executioners didn't kill Rizal, the executioners would have been killed. So he was gunned down, and he's a national hero. Yes, and so that novel in particular is the one that a lot of Filipinos look to as here's this Filipino that stepped forward to criticize the treatment of the Filipinos by this corrupt Spain.
Other questions?
You talked about not really having like Filipino writer models growing up. How do you feel about being one of those models for the next generation of writers?
So just if I could just capture the question for our camera, the question is about how you feel about being one of those model writers since you didn't have those models growing up.
I love it. I do. It's something. It's a responsibility that I don't take lightly. I mean, I write constantly, and I think about when I'm publishing work where I'm as an artist I'm not thinking is this going to be good for the Filipino American community? Is this going to be good for the Filipino presence in the? I'm not thinking about that. What I am doing though is I'm trying to be honest as an artist, and if I'm being honest as an artist, then by default I feel like it will be important. Be part of the conversations. As I entered graduate school, I was able to meet and then find models of Filipino American writers. There's so many that I adore, but at the time, growing up, I didn't have it, and so that's exciting to give that gift for sure. And just even on the way up here, my son had said, "Your books are in the Library of Congress." I said, "Yeah, they are." He's like, "That's pretty cool." I'm like, it is cool. And that's kind of what it's all about in some ways, is that, I'm here. Not me, like we're here. And, no different than the other writers that are trying to speak honestly about their identity, about difficulties, about a number of obstacles in terms of what it means, let's say, to be an American today. And so to have a place, the conversation is exciting, and I would very much hope that any inspiration that I could offer would get those younger writers there faster, to save them time, so they don't have to kind of seek out the models. The models are there, and they can, write their books.
I have a question about the Philippines in terms of have you had a chance to go back, and if you have you had a chance to talk with other writers, current Filipino writers, and has that informed your writing?
Great question. I've not gone at all, and we were supposed to go a while back, and then life got in the way a little bit. My dad goes back often, and as a matter of fact, I was just contacted by a first cousin that I've never met, and we've started kind of trading some letters back and forth. I'm surrounded by Filipino American writers. Most of the Filipino American writers that are writing today I've either met or I'm friends with, and these are friendships that go back now maybe 15 years, if not 20 years, when I was in graduate school. So I'm always seeking out that community, and we share work with each other, and they'll send me their manuscripts when they're working on their books. I just finished reading this beautiful manuscript by Joseph Legaspi, and it comes out next year. It's called Threshold. Joseph is a wonderful poet up in New York, and his first book has already been out. But here's the exciting thing, is that when I met this community, our books hadn't come out yet. And so for years we would help each other, we were reading each other, we were talking, we were meeting at conferences, we thought, I don't think we ever said this out loud, but we thought, I know in the way they spoke about their work that it seemed like this was the case. I think we thought we were doing something very important without saying this is going to be important. And so over the years, what's happened is that these writers have all been publishing lots of books. So Oliver de la Paz, who was mentioned in the introduction, is a dear friend of mine, and he wrote the foreword to Little Anodynes, and there were a number of us: Sarah Gambito, Amy Nizuka Mataro, Pat Rizal, Barbara Jane Reyes. These are all writers that have gone on to win national prizes, and I love that we have this portion of the community. I don't have, I have a pull to the Philippines for curiosity, to be there on the land, but the Philippines that exists for me is very ethereal. It's a Philippines that it's in my ninang, my godmother from Virginia Beach, and her family. It's in the stories my father has told me. It's in having met so many Filipino American writers that we in some ways have built our own kind of free-floating country of ideas. So it's there. I do want to go at some point, and many of my friends have gone on Fulbrights. So I'm on a tenure track assistant professorship right now, so I have to kind of see that all the way through first. But once sabbatical is in the air, maybe I'll try to get there. It is on my list. And I remember I spent a semester in Italy, and I recall talking to my dad, and kind of we were talking, and I told him that I'm sorry that I'm in Italy. Like, there was a way in which I had found a way to get out of the country, but I didn't go to the country. And his take has always been, you'll get there one day. But in the way that my career has been, my poetics and my writing doesn't center around needing the country to authenticate my voice. My voice is more about the mestizo experience, being rooted here as an American and separate. But I would totally love to go. Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
I have two questions. You mentioned earlier that your father was in the Navy, and that a large number of Filipinos joined the Navy and then came to the United States. Now that the Navy bases are closed, has that impacted the influx of Filipinos to the United States? And the second question is, how important do you think it is to teach children a language to maintain that tie to their culture?
So with the first question, I believe that it has impacted, without a doubt, the American presence in the Philippines. As far as changing the wave of immigration, I think legislation did that, because even in post-World War II and opening the doors to allow Filipinos to join the U.S. Navy, there was still, I believe, a number of around 50, no more than 50 Filipino immigrants coming in per year. And then after 30 years of that, I think, and some more legislation came to then allow for families to join and things like that. So I still feel that Filipinos are coming in via the U.S. Navy, but probably not in the numbers that they were when my father was coming in, which was the late 60s and the 70s. There was also a way in which Filipinos weren't allowed to hold positions of leadership in the Navy until, I believe, after the early to mid 70s. So if you were in the U.S. Navy as a Filipino, you probably worked as a steward or in the mess hall to some extent. My father, I'm sure, began in that way, but was able to become a senior chief in supply. So he kind of went a different route, but he was in for a long time. He was in for almost 30 years. But the U.S. Navy it's been a tremendous opportunity for bringing Filipinos here because of the bases here in the States. You can go to Norfolk right now and find a huge Filipino American population there that perhaps the grandfather of those families came in through the U.S. Navy, and now the next generation might be in healthcare or more, let's say, of a professional path. As far as teaching a language and for that language to a child in order to have ties to the culture, I think it's very important. I talk a little bit about this in my memoir because my parents divorced when I was 10. And I remember growing up and having my dad speak Tagalog in the house, and then suddenly he was gone, and I lost that connection. And it didn't take long to just lose it. There was a way in which I could still kind of hear certain words, but even then it wasn't as if I was like fully fluent, but I had a very strong sense that this was who I was, like a portion of who I was. And then so I found myself like seeking out, calling him and talking to him, and then later as a teenager living with him, going to live with him. But my dad really wanted me to embrace being an American in a way that, I think to some it might sound as though he was trying to turn his back on his Filipino heritage, and he wasn't. I think he had a lot of pride that his children didn't speak with his accent, and so I understand that. I think there was, my dad's first name is Romulo, and when he joined the U.S. Navy, the first thing his officer said is, "You're Lou from now on." We're not saying Romulo, you're Lou. And so, that kind of truncated way that language functioned for him, and now he's suddenly lesser of who he was. I think that did something to him that is probably not exceptional to the way other immigrants have faced these kinds of similar obstacles, except that he didn't resent this journey because it provided for his family. It also opened up numerous opportunities that he would have never had in the Philippines. But we still, the beauty of Rosetta Stone being what it is, I have this Tagalog Rosetta Stone program that I've listened to and have gone through here and there, and I'm still trying to relearn things. And then I'll say something to my dad, and my dad will laugh. He's like, "You sound like an American speaking Tagalog." And I'm like, "That's exactly what you wanted, right?" Yeah, this is what. Yeah, here it is. But we can have fun with that. But I've noticed that with our kids, they've shown a huge interest in it. So they still have him as a resource, but then we're hoping, as time goes on, these other communities will kind of emerge too, so that they'll have access to these Filipino American communities elsewhere. When we go, the food is very much a part of our lives. I can cook it from scratch, you know, pandesal, the pancit, you know, lumpia. I'm brushing the wrappers. I'm teaching, you know, the kids how to like paint on the batter on so that it comes up like, you know, like paper almost. So that's ingrained in us. But I think it's because I had that initial connection with language, and I hope that I'll be able to, at the very least, kind of carry on with my kids, like their interest in it.
You have some of your works with you. Do you have a favorite?
Oh, I know. This is the choice. Yeah. I don't have a favorite. It's not, well, no. The favorite is always the book I haven't written. Like it's the book that I'm like working on. Yeah, but no, I do. There are some that are in. You know, there are a few. Would you mind if I read?
No, please do.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is the poem that opens Birthmark, my first collection. The poem is Matamis. Matamis. One summer in Pensacola, I held an orange this way, flesh hiding beneath the texture of the rind, then slipped my thumbs into its core and folded it open like a book. When I held out the halves, the juice seemed to trace the veins in my arms as it dripped down to my elbows in darkened spots of sand. We were sitting on the beach then, the sun, spheres of light within each piece. I remember thinking, in Tagalog, the word matamis is sweet in English, though I did not say it for fear of mispronouncing the language. Instead, I finished the fruit and offered nothing except my silence, and my father, who pried apart another piece, breaking the globe in two, offered me half, meaning everything. Should I read a few more?
You're welcome to.
Okay, let's see. This was always a good one because in this, the speaker has hair. This is wrestling. Before the season, we were already pissed, our bodies tightening around ribs, our eyes like panthers sinking into shadows. We had given up food, sweat until the air around us was heavy. The only thing we cared about was winning. At our first match, I wrestled a guy I had met summers ago at a Filipino gathering, some first communion or baptism. By a man-made lake separating the neighborhood in two, where most of the children had wandered, a few of the boys pinned my shoulders against a tree while one punched me. I could say it was because I was only half a mestizo, but that would be too easy. We were just boys, happy in our anger. When they let me go, their eyes clouded as the lake. I didn't say a word. Years later, when I pulled the one who had punched me down on the mat, I watched the clock as I locked a breath inside his throat. He could have been my brother, his hair the same coarse black strands, his face filled with my shadow. I held him there in front of everyone.
Jon Pineda, trailblazing the Filipino American narrative. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.